It was Christmas Eve, and the cold winter air bit through the tattered coat of James, a homeless veteran who had once served with pride. Now, the streets had become his home, the sounds of the bustling city around him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. His once promising life had crumbled under the weight of hardships, divorce, job loss, and a tragic accident that had left him broken in both body and spirit. As the city glittered with holiday lights, he found himself tucked away in the shadow of a worn-down bench, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered cap. The laughter and cheer of others seemed so distant, like an unreachable world that had moved on without him. He hadn't always been this way. There was a time when Christmas meant family, warmth, and love. But now, those memories were fading like the snowflakes falling around him. The only thing that kept him company on this lonely night was the soft rustle of the wind and the occasional passing car that never slowed. His thoughts wandered to the past. He remembered the medals he had earned, the times he had stood tall and proud, serving his country. Now no one looked at him with respect. He was just another forgotten man on the streets. His eyes, once full of ambition, now reflected the harshness of life's trials. He had seen too much, lost too much, and had nothing left but the silence of the night. As he sat there, clutching a cup of cheap coffee to warm his hands, he couldn't help but wonder if anyone would notice him tonight. If anyone would care that he was here, alone, in the cold. Christmas was supposed to be a time for miracles, for hope, but James had long given up on that. He didn't expect anything anymore, not from life, not from people. But then, just as he was about to pull the collar of his coat up higher, trying to shield himself from the biting wind, a shadow loomed over him. He looked up, his tired eyes squinting to make out the figure before him. It was a tall man, his large frame blocking out the streetlights behind him, casting a long shadow on the ground. The man's face was hard to read, but his presence was undeniable. For a moment, James thought it was just another passerby, someone lost in their own world, too busy to notice him. But this man, he stopped in front of him. "Cold night, huh?" the man said with a calm, almost caring tone. James blinked, his mind trying to process what was happening. Someone had actually spoken to him. Someone had noticed him. The man bent down, extending his hand. "I'm Shaq. You doing all right?" James stared at the hand for a moment. He wasn't sure what to make of this stranger. There was something about him, something kind, something genuine, that seemed so out of place in this unforgiving world. But in that brief moment, for the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Christmas miracles weren't just stories after all. James hesitated for a moment, staring at the man's outstretched hand. His first instinct was to pull away, to retreat into the familiar silence that had surrounded him for months. But something in the stranger's voice, something in his presence, made him pause. It was as though, in that fleeting moment, a connection was being made, one that transcended the cold walls of isolation James had built around himself. He slowly extended his own hand, unsure of what the stranger's intentions were. "James," he muttered, his voice rough from the cold and the years of neglect. The man Shaq smiled, and the warmth in his expression was almost enough to melt the chill in the air. It was like the world had stopped for a second, and James felt seen, really seen, not as a homeless man or a forgotten soul, but as a human being. "James, huh? Good to meet you," Shaq's voice was deep, calm, and reassuring, as though he had been on this path before, encountering souls like James and knowing just what to say to make them feel like they mattered. Shaq didn't sit down next to him. Instead, he remained standing, towering over James. The gesture felt like an offering of space, of respect, something James hadn't felt in a long time. Shaq reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small thermos, offering it to James with a gentle nod. "You look like you could use something warm," Shaq said. James hesitated again, but his thirst for warmth, and perhaps the faintest trace of human connection, overcame his reluctance. He took the thermos and opened it, the rich scent of hot chocolate wafting up to greet him. It wasn't the coffee he had been nursing all night, but it was something far better, something that spoke of kindness, of an understanding that James hadn't realized he still craved. James took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through his chest and arms. For a moment, he closed his eyes, savoring the rare comfort. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice a little stronger now. Shaq sat down on the bench beside him, not too close, but close enough that James could feel his presence. There was no rush, no pressure. The man was just there, offering something James hadn't expected: time. "So, what brings you out here on Christmas Eve?" Shaq asked, his tone gentle but curious. James looked down at his boots, the worn-out leather telling the story of countless miles walked, miles filled with uncertainty and defeat. He had never been one to open up easily. There was no one left to listen. But there was something about Shaq. The way he listened without judgment. The way he didn't rush to fix things. James found himself speaking, just a little bit, and then a little more. It's just me now," James began, his voice trembling with the weight of unspoken pain. "I don't have anyone, not anymore." His eyes drifted to the distant lights of the city, as though searching for some trace of his old life, his old self. Shaq remained silent, his gaze soft but attentive. He didn't try to fill the space with words, instead giving James the room to say whatever he needed to say. "I was in the army," James continued after a long pause. "I thought I had everything figured out. A wife, kids, a future. But life doesn't always work out the way you think it will." His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "I lost my job after the accident. My wife couldn't handle it. She left. The kids, they don't even talk to me anymore." James paused, feeling the weight of his past crushing down on him once more. "Now I'm here. And Christmas doesn't mean anything. It's just another night. Another reminder that I'm alone." The wind picked up again, swirling around them, but for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel the biting cold. He felt heard. Shaq exhaled slowly as though contemplating James's words. Then, without warning, he spoke, his voice low, but filled with an undeniable compassion. "I get it. I've been through my own struggles too. I know what it's like to lose everything, to feel like you're nothing." James turned his head slightly to glance at Shaq. The man's eyes were distant now, looking past the lights of the city, as if lost in his own thoughts. "But the thing is," Shaq continued, "when you hit rock bottom, that's when you realize something important. You're not alone unless you let yourself be. And sometimes, the people who show up when you least expect it are the ones who help you get back on your feet." James was taken aback by Shaq's words. It wasn't some motivational speech or hollow attempt at fixing him. It was real, raw, and grounded in a truth that resonated deep within his soul. There was no denying the pain in Shaq's eyes, but there was also something else, something James couldn't quite place. "You really think so?" James asked, his voice quiet, unsure if he could dare to believe in something like hope again. Shaq nodded slowly. "I know so, but it takes time, man. It takes one step, one moment at a time." The words hung in the air between them, and for a brief second the world seemed to pause. James looked down at his hands, the hands that had once held his children, that had once held the reins of his future. Now they were rough and scarred from years of struggle. But as he gripped the thermos in his hands, he felt the faintest spark of something, something that had been buried beneath the weight of his past. Hope. Shaq shifted, his voice returning to its calm tone. "I know it's hard, but trust me, things can change. I don't know what the future holds for you, James, but I know one thing for sure. You don't have to go through it alone." James didn't know what to say. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years, he felt a small tear form in the corner of his eye. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by his vulnerability. Shaq smiled knowingly, not saying anything, just giving him the space to feel what he needed to feel. And in that moment, something inside James shifted. Maybe it was the warmth of the hot chocolate, or the compassion in Shaq's words. Maybe it was just the sheer surprise of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in so long. But whatever it was, James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone tonight. And for the first time in years, that realization gave him a flicker of hope for a better tomorrow. The night deepened, and the sounds of the city began to fade into a hushed quiet, as though the world itself had paused for Christmas. Shaq and James sat side by side on that bench, the cold air now biting through their clothes, but the warmth of their conversation and shared silence kept them both grounded. James had never expected to find himself here, sharing his pain, his history, with a complete stranger on Christmas Eve. But something about Shaq's presence, his calm demeanor, made it feel safe. "Tell me," Shaq asked after a long silence, his voice steady, but with a curiosity that belied the easy nature of their conversation. "What do you miss the most?" James shifted uncomfortably, as though the question had pulled something from the depths of him that he wasn't prepared to confront. He thought for a moment, the cold winter night providing the perfect backdrop for his mind to wander into the past. I miss hearing my kids laugh," he said quietly, the words tasting bitter as they left his mouth. "I miss the sound of their voices, the way they used to ask me about everything. You know, the little things, the things you don't realize you'll never hear again until they're gone." Shaq nodded, his face unreadable, but James could feel the weight of his understanding. Shaq didn't rush to offer comforting words or hollow reassurances. He simply let James speak, his steady gaze never faltering. For the first time in years, James felt like someone understood, and for the briefest moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. "I get it," Shaq said after a long moment. "I've lost people too. My family, my friends. You think you have everything, and then one day, it's all gone. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in the things we've lost, we forget to look at the things we still have." James turned his head slightly to meet Shaq's gaze. His heart ached with the weight of his past, the decisions he had made, the opportunities he had missed. But Shaq's words, simple yet profound, struck him deeply. It was as if a part of him had been dormant, waiting to be reminded that life wasn't over, that there was still time. Shaq continued, his voice low but firm. What if I told you that your story isn't finished yet? That you're not done, no matter how hard it seems right now? James didn't respond immediately. His mind raced with thoughts of all the ways life had slipped through his fingers. The idea of starting over, of rebuilding what had been broken, seemed almost impossible. But then he remembered something that Shaq had said earlier. The words that had lingered in his mind since they first spoke. You don't have to go through it alone. The thought clung to him like the warmth from the thermos he had cradled in his hands. Maybe it was possible. Maybe he wasn't as far gone as he thought. Do you ever think it's too late to fix things? James asked. His voice barely a whisper. Shaq's response was immediate. No, it's never too late. Life has a funny way of working out. Sometimes, the things we think are the worst things that have happened to us. They turn out to be the things that change us, that give us a new perspective. James felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of fear and hope. The idea that his life could change, that he could change, was a foreign concept. It had been so long since he dared to dream. I don't know if I can change, James said, his voice breaking, betraying the vulnerability he had long buried. I've been on my own for so long. My kids, they won't talk to me. My wife, she's gone. I've burned all the bridges I had. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on James's shoulder. You don't have to fix everything in one night, man. But it starts with one small step, one phone call, one decision to say, I'm not done yet. I can't promise you that it's going to be easy. I can't promise you a perfect future, but I can promise you this. You don't have to stay where you are forever. James looked down at his hands, remembering the warmth of the coffee he had once held, the feeling of being seen, of not being invisible. It was a small thing, but it felt like a lifeline in the middle of his darkness. I don't even know where to start, James said softly. Shaq smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Start by looking around. You've got people who care about you even if they don't know it yet. You have a future ahead of you, even if it seems far away. You just need to take it one moment at a time. The words settled into James's mind like seeds, each one taking root in the soil of his heart. Could he really make a change? Could he reach out to his family, to his children, after all this time? Could he rebuild the bridges he had burned? As if sensing James's uncertainty, Shaq continued, his voice calm and steady. I know it's hard, James. I know it feels impossible. But you have to believe that you're worth more than this. That you're not defined by your mistakes or your past. You're defined by what you choose to do next. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the weight of possibility. For the first time in so long, James felt something stir within him. Something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He wasn't sure where this would all lead. He didn't know if his family would ever speak to him again or if he would ever find his way out of the darkness that had held him captive for so long. But in that moment, James realized something important. He wasn't giving up. As the snowflakes danced around him, James stood up from the bench, his legs stiff from the cold. He took a deep breath, feeling the chill of the winter air fill his lungs. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to take that first step. It was time to believe in the possibility of change. James stood there for a long time, the snow gently falling around him, settling in quiet drifts on the streets of the city. The sounds of distant traffic, faint voices in the distance, the hum of the world carrying on, none of it seemed to matter anymore. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions, and possibilities that were almost too overwhelming to process. Shaq's words rang in his ears, echoing through his heart, reverberating against the walls of his mind. You're not alone. You have a chance to change. It's not over. For years, James had been stuck in the same painful cycle: regrets, anger, isolation, and self-doubt. Every time he tried to reach out, every time he tried to make things right, he was met with rejection, or worse, nothing at all. But tonight had been different. James looked at the empty street, the darkened windows of the buildings around him. And for the first time, he didn't feel quite so alone. He didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel invisible. Shaq had left, but the change inside him had already started to take root. It was small, subtle, but undeniable. Hope. Turning, James began walking slowly down the street. The weight of his past still clung to him like a shadow, but it felt lighter now, as if the burden had been eased just a little. He wasn't sure where he was going, but for the first time in years, he knew that he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't need to figure it all out right away. One step at a time, he thought to himself. One step at a time. As he walked, the quiet of the night seemed to embrace him. The Christmas lights twinkled in the distance, casting a soft, golden glow that warmed the icy sidewalks. The world felt peaceful, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And maybe, just maybe, something was about to change for him. The next day, Christmas morning, James woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside the alleyway where he had found shelter. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long, soft shadows on the streets. He could hear the muffled voices of families gathering for their holiday celebrations, the sounds of laughter and joy carrying through the air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel bitter. He didn't feel like he was a prisoner of his own choices anymore. He simply felt tired, but in a good way. Like he had walked through a storm and had finally come out the other side. It wasn't going to be easy. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the scars of his past were deep. But for the first time, James felt like he had something to fight for. He had hope. And hope, he realized, was the one thing he could control. He knew he needed to start making things right, but he wasn't sure where to begin. His children hadn't spoken to him in years. His wife was long gone, and every attempt to reach out had only led to more pain. But Shaq's words echoed in his mind. You're worth more than this. And in that moment, James realized that he was right. He was worth more than the mistakes he had made, worth more than the darkness that had consumed him for so long. The sun rose higher in the sky, and James slowly made his way to a nearby phone booth. He paused for a moment, his fingers hovering over the receiver. He didn't have a plan, didn't know exactly what to say, but he knew that he had to try. He dialed the number to his daughter's phone. The phone rang once, twice, and then he heard the familiar voice on the other end. Hello? His daughter's voice cracked, a mix of surprise and caution. For a moment, James couldn't speak. His heart was pounding, his palms were sweaty, but he had to say something. It's me, he said, his voice shaking. It's Dad. There was a long pause on the other end, and James braced himself for the rejection, for the silence that usually followed, but instead he heard her soft intake of breath. "Dad?" she asked, as though she couldn't quite believe it. "What do you want?" James swallowed hard, fighting to keep the tears at bay. "I don't know if I can fix everything. I don't know if I can make it right. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be a better person. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know that I love you. And I'm here. Whenever you're ready." He held his breath, waiting for her response. His heart in his throat. The line was quiet for a long time, the silence stretching out between them. And then finally she spoke. I don't know what to say, Dad. It's been a long time." "I know," James replied softly. "But I'm not giving up. I won't give up on you. Or on me." She didn't respond immediately, and James could hear her taking deep breaths, as though processing everything he had just said. I need some time," she said, her voice quieter now. "But thank you. Thank you for reaching out." James's chest tightened, the knot in his throat loosening just a little. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't the happy ending he had dreamed of. But it was a start. It was a sign that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. He wasn't alone in this anymore. That evening, James found himself at a small church, just a few blocks from the park where he had met Shaq. He had been walking around, lost in his thoughts, when he noticed the Christmas Eve service still going on. The door was open, and the warm glow of candles flickered inside, casting a soft, inviting light on the snowy street. Without thinking, James stepped inside. He wasn't sure what he was looking for: comfort, peace, or just a place to sit in silence. But as soon as he walked in, he felt the weight of the world start to lift off his shoulders. The music was soft, the voices of the congregation lifting in unison in a familiar hymn. For the first time in years, James felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if his family would fully accept him back into their lives, if he would ever fully redeem himself, or if the scars of the past would ever fade completely. But in that moment, as he stood in the warmth of the church, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of Christmas, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't done yet. He had been given a second chance, and for the first time in years, he was ready to take it. The lights of the church twinkled softly around him, casting shadows that seemed to stretch out into the future, waiting for him to walk toward them. The night was far from over, and so was his journey, but James was no longer walking alone. The weeks after Christmas were a blur for James. His life, once a quiet routine of uncertainty and loneliness, was slowly shifting. His mornings began with a sense of purpose, even if he wasn't quite sure where it would lead. Each day, he worked to build something, whether it was his own resolve, his relationship with his daughter, or even just the habit of getting up every day and moving forward. He'd stayed at the shelter for the first few nights after Christmas, but soon enough, he began to feel the pull to stand on his own 2 feet again. With the little money he had, James rented a small room in a rundown apartment building. It wasn't much, but it was his, and for the first time in years, it felt like a foundation, even if it was fragile. But the struggle didn't stop there. He found himself facing questions he hadn't thought about in a long time. What kind of man did he want to be now? Could he ever truly forgive himself for the years he had wasted? And would his daughter, after everything, ever truly be able to trust him again? James had spent so many years pushing those questions away. But now, with every new step he took, they seemed to grow louder, demanding his attention. One day, as he sat in his small room, contemplating his next move, he received a text message from his daughter. "Can we meet tomorrow? There's something I want to talk about." His heart leaped in his chest, a mix of nervousness and hope. He'd been waiting for this moment, unsure of when it would come or if it would come at all. He read the message over and over again, each time, the weight of it pressing on him. The following day, James sat in a cafe, waiting anxiously. He had chosen a small, quiet spot by the window, his hands fidgeting with the cup of coffee in front of him. He had no idea what she was going to say. When she walked in, James nearly stood up in surprise. She looked older, more mature, and yet the same. The girl he had once known, the girl he had let down so many times. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room before they locked onto his. The recognition in her eyes was unmistakable, but so was the hesitation. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly as she walked toward him. "Hi," James replied, his voice breaking as he stood to meet her. He could barely contain the wave of emotion that flooded him. He didn't know if he was going to cry, laugh, or just fall into her arms and beg for her forgiveness. But he stayed composed, hoping that his actions would speak louder than his words. They sat down, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. James felt like the room had suddenly grown smaller, the weight of the moment heavy in the air. I've been thinking about everything," she said, her eyes looking away as she spoke. "About you, about me, about what happened. It's been hard, Dad. Really hard. I didn't understand why you left, why you didn't stay, but—" She paused, biting her lip, as though she was searching for the right words. "I don't know what's going on with you now," she continued, her voice quieter. "I don't know if this is just another phase, or if you really want to change. But I'm willing to give you a chance. I'm willing to try. I think that's all I can do." James's heart swelled with gratitude and guilt. He had heard these words before, people saying they would give him a chance. But this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just words. This time, there was hope. "I'm so sorry," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know I can't make up for the past, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. But she didn't wipe it away. Instead, she let it fall, as if acknowledging that the past was a part of her. But it didn't have to define her future. "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know you're trying. I can see it, and that's all I need for now." They sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. But there was something new in the air, something fragile, but real. It wasn't a full reunion, but it was a start that James had longed for, and one he hoped he could build on. After their meeting, James went back to his small room. His thoughts were racing, his heart full. It wasn't a perfect moment, and it wasn't a complete resolution, but it was progress. He had something to build on now. He wasn't alone, not anymore. He had a daughter who was willing to give him a chance. The days that followed were filled with small steps. James started looking for work again. It wasn't easy, but he wasn't expecting it to be. He had too many gaps in his resume, too many years unaccounted for, but he didn't let that stop him. He applied for every job he could, from cleaning services to warehouses. Every no didn't sting as much as it used to. He was used to rejection, but this time, he wasn't giving up. One day, he finally received a call back, a small janitorial position at a local office building. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. It was a step forward. He accepted it without hesitation, determined to make the most of it. And as he walked into the building for his first day of work, James couldn't help but smile. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. The change wasn't going to come overnight. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But he had time now. Time to rebuild, time to prove to himself and to his daughter that he was capable of something more than the man he had once been. Shaq's words echoed in his mind again, the words that had set him on this journey. You have a chance to change. It's not over. James didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, one step at a time. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid.